No one noticed the old janitor mopping the studio floor, except Keanu Reeves. What began as a simple good morning turned into a moment that would change both their lives forever. But when Keanu discovered the heartbreaking secret behind the man's tired smile, what he did next left the entire set in stunned silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The first rays of morning light spilled across the studio lot, glinting off parked trailers and slick black asphalt still damp from an early drizzle. Crew members hurried past one another with clipboards, coffee cups, and headsets, their chatter mixing with the hum of generators and the metallic clatter of equipment being rolled into position. Inside Stage 4, a small army prepared for another long day of filming, lights being tested, props rearranged, monitors flickering to life. Amid the controlled chaos, Keanu Reeves stepped quietly through the entrance, a black hoodie pulled up over his head, his motorcycle helmet tucked under his arm. He wasn't the type to arrive late or make an entrance. He moved with the same understated grace that had defined his career: steady, respectful, unseen, until you realized he'd been there all along. As he walked past the grips and sound crew, he offered a quiet good morning to each of them. Most of the team had been working since before dawn, yet they straightened up when they saw him. His calm energy had that effect, an almost invisible presence that steadied the room without demanding it. A camera operator named Phil called out with a grin, "Morning, Keanu. They got you doing that rooftop scene again?" Keanu smiled faintly and replied, "Looks like it. Hope the coffee's stronger than yesterday." It was a small exchange, but it brought a flicker of warmth to a crew otherwise drowned in routine. While everyone else was focused on hitting the production schedule, one man moved silently along the edge of the set. Walter Hayes, 68 years old, carried a mop bucket and a stack of rags in his hands. His back was slightly bent, his shoulders hunched from years of heavy lifting and quiet endurance. His gray hair curled damply under the fluorescent lights, and his weathered hands bore the marks of hard work calluses, small scars, and the faint tremor of exhaustion. He had been at the studio longer than most of the crew members combined. He'd seen stars rise and fall, sets torn down and rebuilt, stories captured and forgotten. Yet he remained invisible, part of the background like the creak of the scaffolding or the buzz of the lights. No one looked at him twice. As Walter began mopping near the corridor leading to the wardrobe trailers, a young assistant nearly bumped into him, muttering something under her breath about getting in the way. He apologized softly and moved aside, continuing his rhythm dip, ring, swipe, repeat. The mop water turned gray as it soaked up the remnants of spilled coffee and footprints from the morning rush. Then came the sound of calm footsteps, measured, unhurried. Walter looked up briefly and froze when he realized who it was. Keanu Reeves had stopped right in front of him. For a moment, neither spoke. Walter instinctively straightened, embarrassed to be seen doing what so many ignored. He started to move his bucket aside, but Keanu beat him to it, taking the heavy mop handle gently from his hand and moving a tangled cable that had been blocking the path. "There you go," Keanu said simply. "Didn't want you tripping over that." Walter blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I was just finishing this section." Keanu shook his head. "No worries. Take your time. You keeping busy this morning?" Walter gave a small chuckle. "Always something to clean up around here." Keanu smiled, the kind that felt genuine, like he wasn't just being polite, but actually meant it. He extended a hand slightly, as if offering recognition rather than introduction. "I'm Keanu." "I know," Walter said softly, almost laughing. "Everybody knows." Keanu grinned. "Well, what's your name?" "Walter. Walter Hayes." "Well, Walter, it's good to meet you." Keanu's voice carried no hint of superiority, no performance of humility, just calm sincerity. He reached for a stray towel on the floor and placed it on a nearby cart before stepping aside to let Walter continue. Walter stood there a moment longer, quietly processing the exchange. Around them, the chaos of production resumed, the calls for camera resets, the shuffle of movement, but for that brief instant, the noise seemed to fade. When Keanu turned to leave, he said gently, "Good morning, sir." Walter didn't expect to hear the word sir. No one called him that anymore. He nodded, trying to hide the faint sting of emotion behind his tired smile. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves." Across the stage, a young assistant noticed the scene and whispered to a coworker, "Is he seriously talking to the janitor?" The other shrugged. "Guess he's just weird like that." They snickered, returning to their phones. But Keanu didn't hear them, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. He simply continued walking toward the makeup trailer, shoulders relaxed, expression thoughtful. Behind him, Walter resumed mopping, but the rhythm was different now, lighter, steadier, almost grateful. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked him in the eyes. As the morning wore on, the set grew louder, voices overlapped, walkie-talkies crackled, and someone yelled about a missing prop. Amid it all, Walter moved quietly, a ghost in plain sight. He swept near the lighting rigs, careful not to disturb anyone. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of that brief moment, the handshake, the smile, the word sir. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with that kind of respect. Keanu, meanwhile, sat in the makeup chair, his mind still on the encounter. He'd seen plenty of people in this industry who treated others like furniture people who nodded at cameras but ignored the ones holding the cables. Watching Walter reminded him of his own early days, when he had been the quiet one in the corner, unnoticed, hungry, uncertain. He thought of the kindnesses that had shaped him, the small moments that cost nothing but meant everything. From the corner of the room, Keanu noticed Walter again, still working with care, wringing out the mop with deliberate precision. A crew member brushed past him without acknowledgement, spilling a cup of coffee that splashed across the freshly cleaned floor. Walter crouched down immediately, dabbing the spill with a rag, never saying a word. Something inside Keanu tightened. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. The quiet endurance of someone who gave his best, with no applause, no spotlight. He stood up, excused himself, and walked toward the set entrance again. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, casting long beams across the pavement. Keanu paused, helmet in hand, and looked back at the studio. The day was just beginning, but something inside him already knew this wasn't the last time he'd speak with the man who cleaned the floor no one else saw. A light breeze swept across the open lot as crew trucks rumbled in, their tires crunching over gravel. Walter finished wringing out his mop, his hands red from the cold water. He glanced toward the trailer row where Keanu had disappeared moments earlier. Part of him wondered if he had imagined it, if a man like that would really stop just to talk to someone like him. Yet the memory felt too real to doubt. He went back to work, humming softly to himself, the tune faint and trembling. As he polished the last section of The Floor, one of the younger janitors approached. "Hey, Walter," the man said with disbelief. "Was that Keanu Reeves helping you move that cable earlier?" Walter smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's decent. Seems like a good man." The young janitor shook his head, still astonished. Guess not all movie stars are the same. He walked off, shaking his head, but the awe in his voice lingered like an echo. Inside, Keanu returned to the soundstage. Cameras were rolling tests, and the director barked orders from behind a monitor. Yet Keanu's focus was elsewhere. As he stood under the glare of artificial lights, he caught sight of Walter again, pushing his mop bucket through a narrow corridor, still invisible to most. Keanu's gaze followed him until he disappeared behind a set wall. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself before the first take. To anyone else, it was just another morning on set. But for Keanu, something had shifted in awareness, a quiet pull toward the people who worked without recognition. He didn't know why this man's presence lingered in his thoughts, only that it did. Somehow, he sensed that small act of kindness had opened a door neither of them saw coming. By late morning, the energy on set had shifted from preparation to performance. Actors rehearsed lines under bright lights, while production assistants rushed between trailers. Every corner of the soundstage seemed alive except the narrow hallway at the back, where Walter Hayes quietly went about his work. He moved with practiced rhythm, broom in one hand, dustpan in the other, humming a slow tune from some forgotten decade. His songs were always gentle, the kind meant to fill silence rather than command attention. As he swept, his mind wandered to two small faces, Emma and Michael, waiting for him back home. They'd be getting ready for school now, probably eating the toast he left for them before sunrise. He smiled faintly at the thought. Walter's days began before dawn. He caught the 5:10 bus downtown, carrying a small lunch pail and a folded newspaper he never read. After clocking in, he started cleaning restrooms, polishing mirrors, and mopping the long corridors that wound through the studio like veins. Few people noticed him. Some offered quick hellos. Most didn't bother. To many, he was part of the background, like the walls, the lights, or the dull hum of air conditioning. But Walter didn't mind silence. It gave him time to think. He'd once been a machinist in a factory that built auto parts, proud of the steady work and good benefits. That job had kept his family afloat for nearly 30 years until the plant closed and everything fell apart. The layoffs came fast, the severance small, and soon his savings disappeared trying to keep his daughter's medical bills paid. When she passed, he took custody of her children without a second thought. "They've lost enough already," he told the caseworker. The next day, he found work wherever he could, first as a janitor at a grocery store, then eventually here at the film studio. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it kept the lights on. He took pride in doing his job well, even if no one noticed. The floor's shine, the scent of lemon polish, the spotless mirrors, all small victories that reminded him he still had control over something. As he worked near the set's entrance, a few extras walked by, chatting loudly. One tossed an empty coffee cup on the ground without looking. Walter bent down, picked it up, and placed it in the trash can. He wasn't angry, just used to it. People often assumed he didn't hear or feel the things they said. They were wrong. Later, as lunch hour neared, he rolled his cart past the wardrobe department. Inside, actors and stylists talked about upcoming red carpets and designer brands. He smiled politely when one of them brushed past him, offering no eye contact. It wasn't malice, it was simply habit, the kind born from years of invisible labor that made the world keep turning while others took bows. Still, when Walter looked around the studio, he saw something few others did. Beneath the glamour and cameras, this place was built on sweat on the electricians, the drivers, the cleaners. Without them, nothing worked. It was a truth he carried quietly, like a secret no one wanted to hear. After the lunch rush, the studio cafeteria emptied out, leaving behind half-eaten sandwiches and paper cups scattered across tables. Walter entered with his mop and bucket, glancing around the room that only an hour ago had been filled with laughter and chatter. The smell of reheated food lingered in the air. He began cleaning methodically, starting with the sticky spots under the tables where juice had spilled. The dishwasher staff greeted him kindly, though even they rarely spoke more than a few sentences at a time. "Long day, Walter?" one of them asked. He smiled faintly. "Every day's long, but that's how I know it's honest work." They exchanged a nod before going back to stacking trays. Walter's words were simple, but they carried the kind of wisdom that only comes from endurance. He'd learned not to expect applause. The reward was in doing the job well and getting to go home knowing the place looked better than he'd found it. When the cafeteria was spotless, Walter sat for a moment in the corner to unwrap his small lunch. 2 ham sandwiches, a banana, and a thermos of black coffee. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 1 o'clock. The kids would be in class now. He could almost picture them sitting at their desks. Emma sketching flowers in the margins of her notebook. Michael fidgeting restlessly, counting down to recess. The thought warmed him, but it also ached. He missed his daughter terribly. Sometimes he caught himself turning to say something to her, only to remember she was gone. He still carried her photo in his wallet, the edges worn from years of opening and closing it. In that picture, she was smiling at a summer picnic, holding the 2 kids in her lap. Every time he saw it, he silently promised to keep them safe and give them a better life, no matter how hard it became. The clang of a dropped tray pulled him back to reality. A group of younger crew members had entered, joking loudly. One of them noticed Walter sitting alone and muttered, "Guess someone's got to clean up after the stars." They laughed and walked past him, leaving behind new crumbs on the floor. Walter said nothing. He waited until they left, then quietly resumed cleaning. Out in the hallway, he passed framed movie posters lining the walls, films that had made millions. He'd helped clean those sets too. Sometimes he looked at the actors' smiling faces and thought, "They get remembered. The rest of us fade away." But even as the thought came, he shook his head. That kind of thinking didn't help anyone. He pushed his cart toward the main stage again, where he would mop the floor for the afternoon shoot. As he worked, he hummed the same tune he always did, a simple melody his late wife used to sing while washing dishes. It carried through the empty hallway like a whisper, unnoticed by everyone but him. By mid-afternoon, the studio pulsed with the chaos of another take. Voices echoed, walkie-talkies buzzed, and cables coiled across the floor like veins of metal. Walter maneuvered his mop bucket carefully between the chaos, timing each movement so as not to interrupt the flow of filming. He knew every rhythm of this place. The coffee breaks, the arguments, the applause. After a good scene, he was a ghost among stars, moving unseen, yet holding the set together. As he mopped a corner near the camera rigs, he caught fragments of conversation from a nearby group of young actors. They were laughing, leaning against prop crates, their confidence loud enough to fill the air. "Hollywood royalty," one of them joked, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket. "Some people were just born to shine, right?" Another laughed. "And others were born to clean up after them." Their laughter stung more than they realized. Walter didn't flinch outwardly, but something inside him tightened. He kept his eyes down, wringing out the mop. He had heard worse, but it always hurt the same way, not because of pride, but because it reminded him how easily the world divided people into visible and invisible. Still, he refused to let bitterness take root. He focused on the floor, on the clean reflection appearing beneath each pass of his mop. The shine was his quiet rebellion, a statement that even unnoticed work could hold dignity. When the actors left, Keanu passed through the same hallway, heading toward the makeup trailer. He noticed Walter crouched down, cleaning a stubborn scuff mark near the wall. The actor hesitated for a second, watching the old man work with careful precision. For Keanu, the image lingered, a man who gave everything to a job most people overlooked. Later, when the studio lights dimmed for the evening, Walter leaned on his mop handle, gazing across the now empty stage. The echo of laughter still hung in the air, but he didn't resent it. He'd learned long ago that the world wasn't fair, but it could still be kind. He wiped his forehead with a folded rag and whispered softly, "Almost done for the day." His voice was tired but steady. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, signaling the crew's exit. He was the last to leave, as always. Before turning off the lights, he looked back at the gleaming studio floor so clean it reflected the ceiling lights like stars. For everyone else, it was just another workday. For Walter, it was proof that even the forgotten could leave something shining behind. The next morning dawned calm and golden, sunlight spilling across the studio lot as if the world had been gently wiped clean overnight. Keanu arrived early again, coffee in hand, his quiet presence immediately grounding the crew around him. He greeted the security guard, nodded to the lighting team, and smiled at the caterer who was setting up breakfast trays. Every small gesture mattered to him. It wasn't habit, it was respect. Between takes, as the camera department adjusted lenses and the director discussed angles, Keanu slipped out into the corridor that ran behind the soundstage. The hallway was narrow, lined with utility doors and stacked supply crates. A faint humming echoed from around the corner, a familiar tune. When he turned, he saw Walter Hayes wrestling with a heavy bucket full of cleaning solution, a roll of paper towels balanced precariously on top. The old man's movements were slow but deliberate, his face flushed from effort. Without thinking twice, Keanu set his coffee down and walked over. "Hey, let me help with that." Walter turned, startled. "Oh, Mr. Reeves, no, it's fine. I've got it." Keanu smiled lightly. "You look like you've been carrying more than one man's share this morning." Walter chuckled under his breath, trying to make light of it. Well, I've been doing this a long time. You get used to carrying things that don't get any lighter. Keanu reached for the handle anyway. Still, no harm in letting someone lend a hand. Reluctantly, Walter allowed him to lift the bucket, surprised by how naturally Keanu did it. Most people in his position wouldn't have even noticed him, let alone helped. He expected a quick favor and a polite exit, but instead, Keanu leaned against the wall, taking a brief rest, as if he had all the time in the world. How long have you been here? Keanu asked. Almost 10 years, Walter said, wiping his hands on his work pants. Started part-time. Now, I do the morning shifts. Keeps me busy, you know. Busy's good, Keanu said softly. Gives the mind somewhere to go. There was something in his tone, something quiet and knowing, that made Walter glance up. For a moment, he wondered if the famous actor standing before him understood what it meant to use work as a distraction. The two men shared a silence that felt strangely comfortable. Keanu broke it with a small smile. Do you have family around? Walter nodded slowly. 2 grandchildren. I'm raising them myself. They're good kids, smart, kind. It's been rough since my daughter passed. The words came out softer than he meant them to. He hadn't planned on sharing that with anyone, least of all a movie star. But Keanu's presence made it easy to speak without feeling small. Keanu's expression changed instantly. His jaw tightened, and for a second, his eyes seemed to drift somewhere else, somewhere far away, where grief still lived quietly beneath the surface. I'm sorry, he said gently. Losing someone like that, it never really leaves, does it? Walter shook his head. No, you just learn to keep walking. Keanu nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, you walk with it. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Walter recognized the weight behind them, the sound of someone speaking from experience, not sympathy. Walter steadied himself against the wall, feeling the heaviness of memory slip into the quiet space between them. The hallway was empty, save for the faint hum of lights above and the distant rumble of moving carts. For once, he didn't feel like part of the background. Someone was actually listening. Keanu's gaze remained steady, his manner gentle but focused, as though this conversation mattered as much as any scene he'd ever filmed. How old are your grandkids? He asked, breaking the silence with warmth rather than pity. Emma's 10, Walter said, a faint smile forming. She loves to draw. Can't stop sketching flowers, even on her homework. And Michael's 8. He's got too much energy for his own good. Keeps me on my toes. Keanu chuckled softly. Sounds like good kids. You must be proud. I am, Walter said, his eyes softening. They're all I've got left, really. I just want them to grow up kind. The world doesn't make that easy anymore. Keanu nodded, the words striking closer to his heart than he expected. Kindness, he said quietly. That's the real test, isn't it? You can lose everything else and still hold on to that. Walter studied him for a moment. You sound like someone who's been through it. Keanu's eyes flickered with something distant pain, but also peace. I've lost people, he admitted after a pause. Family, friends. It changes how you see things, makes you notice the little stuff others overlook. He looked down at his hands, then at Walter. Like people who work harder than anyone realizes. Walter felt his throat tighten. No one had ever spoken to him that way, not about his work, not about his worth. Most treated him like part of the building, useful but invisible. Yet here was a man the world worshipped for his fame, standing in a dim hallway, speaking to him as if they were equals. Walter tried to deflect, smiling awkwardly. You don't have to say that, Mr. Reeves. I'm just a janitor. Keanu shook his head immediately. You're not just anything. You're someone making things better. That matters. The sincerity in his tone silenced Walter. He could feel his heart tightening, caught between humility and disbelief. He had spent decades working in silence, convinced his life existed in the periphery of others' dreams. But now, with one sentence, that illusion cracked. A production assistant's voice interrupted from down the hall. "Mr. Reeves, they're ready for you." Keanu nodded, then turned back to Walter with a small, reassuring smile. "Duty calls," he said lightly. "But I'll catch up with you later, okay?" Walter nodded, still trying to find the right words. "Thank you for helping with the bucket." Keanu shrugged with a hint of a grin. "You were doing all the heavy lifting before I showed up." As Keanu walked away, Walter stood in the quiet corridor for a moment longer, his hand still resting on the handle of the bucket. For the first time in years, the burden didn't feel quite so heavy. Walter lingered in the hallway long after Keanu disappeared around the corner. The conversation replayed in his mind the way Keanu had looked at him, not through him. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried a depth Walter hadn't felt in years. He took a deep breath, then slowly pushed his cart toward the maintenance room. His steps felt lighter somehow. Inside, he set the bucket down and rubbed his aching shoulder. The scent of cleaning supplies filled the air, sharp, sterile, familiar. He stared at his reflection in the small metal sink. For years, he had told himself this was just a job, nothing more. But now, standing there, he realized it had become his life. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't something to be ashamed of. Meanwhile, back on set, Keanu moved through his scenes with quiet focus. But between takes, his mind kept wandering to that hallway and the look in Walter's eyes when he mentioned his daughter. The grief had been raw and unguarded, the kind of pain that never really fades. It stirred something old inside him, memories he usually kept buried. When the director called for a short break, Keanu slipped away again, walking outside into the sunlight. The studio's noise faded behind him. He thought about how many Walters he'd probably passed in his life, without noticing how many invisible stories hid behind tired smiles. For all his fame and fortune, moments like this reminded him why humility mattered. He took a sip of water, staring at the horizon over the lot. The same world that celebrated heroes on screen rarely looked twice at the real ones. Walter was one of them, holding his family together, carrying loss with dignity, showing up every day when no one thanked him. Inside the janitor's closet, Walter pulled out a folded drawing from his pocket. Emma had made it the night before, a colorful picture of the three of them, labeled, "My Family." He smiled faintly and pinned it to the corkboard above the shelf. Outside, Keanu walked past the same corridor again. For a brief second, their eyes met through the open door. Walter gave a nod, humble but grateful. Keanu returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement. Two men from entirely different worlds, bound for a fleeting moment by shared grief and mutual respect. Neither said a word, but both understood. Something real had begun, something that neither fame nor circumstance could ever erase. By the next morning, the story had already started to spread across the set. It began as a passing comment, a whisper over breakfast, a smirk exchanged in the makeup trailer. "Did you see Keanu talking to the janitor yesterday?" someone said. "Guess he's working on his next charity role." The tone was light, but the mockery lingered. Within hours, everyone seemed to have an opinion. A few crew members rolled their eyes and laughed it off, assuming it was just another one of Keanu's weird nice guy moments. Others, less kind, began making jokes at Walter's expense. The janitor, who had gone about his duties quietly for years, suddenly found himself the subject of unwanted attention. While sweeping near the lighting rigs, Walter overheard snippets of conversation. "He's probably trying to get some sympathy points," one grip muttered. Another snickered. "Imagine being so lonely you have to talk to the janitor for company." The words stung, but Walter kept his head down. He had endured worse in his life factory layoffs, funerals, long nights of worry, but hearing people laugh about something so small, something genuine, left a hollow ache in his chest. Later, in the props department, a young production assistant decided to imitate him. With exaggerated motions, he limped across the floor, holding an imaginary mop, pretending to be Walter greeting Keanu. The others around him laughed, one even recording a short clip on their phone before someone told them to stop. Walter walked in a few moments later, unaware of what had just happened. The laughter died instantly, replaced by awkward silence. He nodded politely, as if nothing had happened, and went back to work. But the mood had changed. He could feel the stares, the pity, the unspoken judgment. Meanwhile, Keanu remained unaware, at least for the first half of the day. Between scenes, he noticed some of the crew chuckling quietly when he passed, though he couldn't tell why. It wasn't until lunch that he heard the truth. As he approached the catering table, he caught two assistants whispering nearby. "So, how's your buddy the janitor doing?" One of them joked, her voice low, but not low enough. Keanu paused. "Excuse me?" The two froze, instantly regretting their words. "Oh, nothing, Mr. Reeves. Just joking around." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't raise his voice, but his expression hardened. "If you think kindness is something to joke about," he said calmly, "then maybe you're in the wrong business." He turned and walked away before they could respond, his words hanging heavy in the air. The entire table fell silent. For the first time, the laughter that had followed him all morning vanished completely. Yet Keanu's face stayed composed, serious, but not angry. Inside, though, something shifted. He began to see the quiet cruelty that often hid behind everyday indifference. The rest of the day moved slowly, heavy with the kind of unease that spreads when shame lingers, unspoken. Keanu continued filming, delivering lines and hitting marks with the same professionalism as always, but his eyes held a different weight. Between takes, he watched the people around him more closely. The background workers who moved like ghosts through the set. He noticed the man adjusting the lights, who hadn't eaten since dawn. The woman hauling cables who smiled through exhaustion. The driver who waited 12 hours outside just to make sure everyone got home safe. These were the people who made the studio run. Yet no one seemed to see them. It wasn't just Walter. It was everyone like him, people the spotlight never touched. During one break, Keanu stepped off set and walked toward the far end of the soundstage, where Walter was cleaning near a stack of heavy equipment cases. The older man was bent over, wringing out a rag, humming the same tune as always. His movements were slow, careful, precise. Keanu hesitated before approaching, giving him space. "Hey, Walter," he called gently. Walter looked up, smiling faintly. "Mr. Reeves, hope I'm not in your way." "You're never in the way," Keanu said, leaning against a nearby crate. "I just wanted to check in. How's your day going?" Walter chuckled softly. "Same as yesterday. Floors don't clean themselves." Keanu smiled. "If they did, half this town would be out of work." Walter laughed lightly, shaking his head. "You're not wrong about that." They stood there for a few seconds, the silence between them, natural, even comfortable. Then Keanu noticed something: how Walter's left leg stiffened slightly when he moved, the faint limp that others had mocked earlier. It wasn't exaggerated or dramatic. It was simply part of him. Keanu didn't ask about it. Instead, he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who worked hard, no matter what anyone thought." Walter tilted his head. "You mean your dad?" Keanu's lips pressed together, briefly before he answered. "No, someone better, a friend. He used to tell me that a man's value isn't measured by applause, but by what he does when no one's watching." Walter's eyes softened. "That's a good way to live. It's the only way that matters," Keanu said quietly. A stage manager passed by, carrying a clipboard, glancing briefly at them before moving on. The sight of an A-list actor casually talking with the janitor still drew attention, but Keanu didn't care. To him, this moment felt more real than anything happening on camera. When the assistant director called him back to set, Keanu nodded to Walter. "I'll see you around, yeah?" Walter gave a small wave, his smile genuine. "You take care now, Mr. Reeves." As Keanu walked away, he caught his reflection in a metal prop wall. Behind him, Walter continued wiping the floor, the bucket beside him glinting under the light. The image stayed with him long after the next scene began. Evening settled over the studio, the fading sunlight casting long shadows through the open bay doors. The day's chaos had quieted to a low hum as crew members packed up equipment and shut off the stage lights one by one. Keanu walked toward the parking lot, his helmet dangling from his hand, but his thoughts weren't on the film or the day's work. They were on Walter. Something about the way the man carried himself, quiet and uncomplaining, reminded Keanu of people he had lost, those who had faced hardship without bitterness. As he approached the small janitor's closet near the back of the set, he noticed Walter still inside, sitting on a stool beside his mop bucket, rubbing his knees. His thermos sat on the floor, untouched, the coffee inside probably cold by now. Keanu hesitated for only a second before walking in, holding a cup of hot coffee he had picked up on his way out. "You still here?" he asked softly. Walter looked up, startled, then smiled. "Yeah, just finishing up. Long day." Keanu handed him the cup. "Thought you could use this." Walter blinked, taking it slowly, as if unsure it was meant for him. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to," Keanu said simply. "You remind me of someone who taught me the meaning of strength." Walter stared at him, words catching in his throat. The coffee trembled slightly in his hand. I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied. "Just keep being you." Walter's eyes glistened as he tried to steady his voice. Not many people see janitors that way. Keanu smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time more people did. They sat in quiet understanding for a moment. The air smelled faintly of soap and sawdust, the kind of scent that clings to hard work. Walter finally took a sip of the coffee, exhaling with relief. Keanu rose, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder before heading toward the door. "Good night, Walter. Good night, Mr. Reeves," Walter said, his voice thick but steady. As Keanu walked into the night, the studio behind him buzzed faintly with generators and distant laughter. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. Somewhere inside that building was a man who had reminded him that real dignity lives in quiet corners, carried by those the world forgets to see. The rain came suddenly that evening, hammering against the studio roof in steady, rhythmic waves. The crew had already gone home, leaving the massive soundstage empty and echoing. Only a few low lights remained on, casting golden reflections across the wet floor. In the middle of it all, Walter Hayes worked alone, pushing his mop through the puddles near the loading bay. His worn jacket clung to his shoulders, the faint smell of rain mixing with floor polish and silence. He preferred working late. The quiet allowed his thoughts to wander, free from the constant noise of people rushing past him. Tonight, however, his mind felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the lingering sting of the laughter from earlier in the week. People forgot quickly, but words had a way of sticking to the heart, longer than dirt stuck to the floor. He paused, leaning against his mop handle. Through the high windows, the rain shimmered beneath the floodlights outside. He thought of Emma and Michael, hopefully asleep by now, warm under their blankets. He wished he could give them more, something beyond secondhand toys and borrowed time. His daughter would have wanted that. The ache in his chest returned, dull but familiar. A sudden sound broke his thoughts, the distant rumble of a motorcycle. Walter frowned. It was late, long past the time any actor or technician should have been around. The engine grew louder, then stopped just outside the studio doors. Moments later, the door creaked open, letting in a gust of rain and a figure soaked through from head to toe. Keanu Reeves stepped inside, shaking water from his hair. He wore no jacket, just a dark shirt clinging to his shoulders, droplets running down his sleeves. He spotted Walter immediately, standing near the center of the set with mop in hand. "Evening," Keanu called out, his voice calm but tired. Walter blinked, surprised. "Mr. Reeves, what are you doing here this late?" "Forgot my jacket," Keanu said with a small grin, motioning toward the wardrobe trailer behind him. "Didn't realize it would pour like this." Walter chuckled, setting his mop aside. "Looks like the weather caught both of us off guard." Keanu walked closer, the soles of his boots squeaking against the wet concrete. He stopped a few feet away, watching the rain slide down the tall glass panes above. "You ever notice how rain makes the world quieter?" he asked. Walter tilted his head, listening. The sound filled the vast space like a soft heartbeat. "Yeah," he said finally. "It washes the noise away for a while, makes things feel clean again." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's a good way to put it," They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle swish of the mop in water. Walter couldn't help but wonder what brought Keanu back, really. It couldn't just be a forgotten jacket. Keanu lingered near the doorway, glancing at the storm outside before stepping further in. The overhead lights flickered faintly, giving the set a strange, dreamlike glow. He watched Walter mop the far corner, methodical and patient, each stroke of the mop steady and unhurried. Something about it felt grounding. In a world that moved too fast, Walter moved at the pace of a man who understood time differently. Someone who had already learned what really mattered. "You ever get tired of it?" Keanu asked quietly. Walter looked up, puzzled. "Of what?" "Cleaning up after everyone else," Keanu said. "Doing the work no one notices." Walter gave a short laugh, not bitter, but knowing. "Sure, some days more than others, but I try not to think about it that way. A clean place feels better to everyone, even if they never say it. It's like proof that someone still cares." Keanu leaned against a support beam, arms folded. "That's a powerful way to see it." Walter shrugged. "I just do what I can. The world doesn't always pay attention to the little things, but that doesn't mean they don't matter." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "You sound like someone who's lost enough to know what really counts." Walter hesitated, gripping the mop handle. "I've lost plenty." His voice softened, almost breaking. "My daughter, she passed a few years ago. Car accident. She was all I had after my wife died. Now it's just me and the grandkids." The words hung heavy in the air, blending with the steady rhythm of the rain. Keanu didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. Walter took a deep breath. "She used to tell me to keep my chin up no matter how hard life got. I didn't listen back then. I was too angry. But when I look at her kids, I know I've got to keep going. For them." Keanu's voice was gentle when he finally spoke. "You're doing more than you think, Walter. They're lucky to have you." Walter looked down at the floor, his reflection warped in the wet surface. "I don't know. Some nights, it feels like I'm just surviving, not living." Keanu stepped closer. "Surviving takes strength. Some people never even get that far." Walter met his eyes. There was no pity there, just shared understanding. The kind of empathy that only comes from walking through grief and still choosing to move forward. Keanu's tone softened even more. "I lost someone too, a long time ago. And even after all these years, the pain doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it differently." Walter nodded. "Yeah, you walk with it." Keanu smiled faintly, recognizing his own words reflected back at him. "Exactly." For a while, neither spoke. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Not uncomfortable, but healing in its simplicity. Two men, each carrying their own ghosts, standing together in the quiet shelter of an empty studio. Minutes passed before either man moved again. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof, until it drowned out everything else. Walter leaned the mop against the wall and took a seat on a nearby crate. Keanu joined him, sitting across with his elbows resting on his knees, both men facing the shimmer of puddles reflecting the stage lights. Walter exhaled slowly. "You know, no one ever asks how the janitor's doing," he said, half smiling. "People see the clean floor, but they never think about the person who made it that way." Keanu nodded. "That's their loss." Walter blinked, the simple reply hitting harder than he expected. He looked down at his hands, calloused and wrinkled, the skin marked by years of quiet labor. "Most folks just walk right past. Guess they figure we don't need much. But sometimes, all a man wants is to be seen." Keanu looked at him thoughtfully. "You've earned that and more, Walter. The world would be better if more people worked with your heart." The words hung in the air like warmth cutting through the cold. Walter didn't speak for a while. When he finally did, his voice was softer. "You really believe that, don't you?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I do. I think the people who stay kind when no one's watching are the strongest ones." Walter studied him, his old eyes narrowing with curiosity. "You've lost people too, haven't you? I can hear it in your voice." Keanu looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. "Yeah, I've said goodbye more times than I'd like, but it teaches you something." "What's that?" Walter asked quietly. "That love doesn't end," Keanu said. "It just changes form. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes it becomes the reason you keep showing up." Walter nodded, his throat tightening. "That's beautiful." The lights flickered again, and thunder rumbled outside. For a long moment, they simply sat there, two silhouettes in the empty studio, one man rich in fame, the other rich in quiet endurance. Finally, Keanu stood and reached for his helmet. "You get home safe, Walter. Those grandkids need their hero." Walter smiled, his eyes misting. "I'm no hero, Mr. Reeves." Keanu shook his head gently. "You're wrong about that." With that, he turned toward the door. Rain lashed against the pavement as he stepped outside, water soaking his boots. Walter watched him go until the sound of the motorcycle faded into the storm. For the first time in a long while, the old janitor felt seen not as a shadow in the background, but as a man who mattered. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind damp streets and the faint scent of rain still clinging to the air. The sun rose over the studio lot, its light bouncing off puddles scattered along the sidewalks. Crew members arrived in their usual rush, coffee cups in hand, voices echoing across the opened gates. Among the noise and movement, two small figures stood near the security post, waiting patiently, their faces pressed against the metal bars of the fence. Keanu noticed them first as he walked in, motorcycle helmet tucked under his arm. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, their clothes slightly too big, their shoes frayed at the edges. One of them, a girl with dark curls pulled into a loose ponytail, was trying to fix the chain of a rusted bicycle while the younger boy held it steady. Every few seconds, she'd stop and wipe her hands on her jeans, sighing in frustration. Keanu approached quietly, his natural calm keeping the children at ease. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down so he was at their eye level. "Looks like you two are early for something." The boy straightened, blinking up at him. "We're waiting for Grandpa," he said. "He works here." Keanu smiled. "Your grandpa wouldn't happen to be Walter Hayes, would he?" Both children nodded eagerly. "You know him?" the girl asked. "I do," Keanu said. "He's a good man." The girl smiled shyly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm Emma, and this is my brother Michael." Michael gave a small wave, clutching the bike handle with both hands. "Grandpa said we could ride our bikes while we wait, but mine's broken," he muttered. Keanu examined the bicycle. It was old, the tires worn thin, the frame covered in patches of rust. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Michael hesitated, then nodded. Keanu knelt beside the bike, turning the chain slowly between his fingers. "You've got a stubborn one here," he said with a grin. "But I think I can fix it for now." The kids watched intently as Keanu reattached the chain and spun the wheel, his hands moving with quiet focus. He wiped the grease on his jeans, gave the pedal a push, and the chain clicked smoothly back into place. "There you go," he said, standing up. "Good as new. Well, good enough to get you home." Michael's face lit up. "Thanks, mister." Keanu smiled. "You can call me Keanu." Emma's eyes widened. "Wait, you're that Keanu Reeves?" He chuckled softly. "That's what people say. But don't tell anyone I'm terrible with bike chains." The two laughed, the kind of innocent laughter that brightened the whole morning. For a moment, Keanu felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Keanu leaned against the studio gate, still talking with the children as crew trucks rolled by. They seemed oblivious to the noise around them, completely caught up in the simple excitement of being noticed. Emma glanced through the fence toward the soundstage. "Grandpa said you're one of the good ones," she said. "He said you actually talk to people." Keanu smiled warmly. "Well, your grandpa makes it pretty easy to talk to him. He's got more wisdom in one smile than most people have in a lifetime." Michael grinned proudly. "He's the best. He gets up early every day, just so we can have breakfast before school." He makes pancakes on Sundays, burnt ones, but we still eat them. That made Keanu laugh softly, shaking his head. Burnt pancakes, huh? That sounds familiar. Emma tilted her head. You don't have kids, do you? Keanu's expression softened. No, I don't. But I've got a lot of people I care about. Family isn't always who you're born to, it's who you keep close. The girl nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood more than her age should allow. That's what Grandpa says, too. He says love doesn't disappear. It just finds new places to live. Keanu's chest tightened at that. He thought of all the people he'd lost: his parents, his partner, friends, gone too soon. Their absence never left him. It had only changed shape, just like Walter had said the night before. Emma looked down at her sneakers, the soles coming loose. We used to have nicer bikes, she murmured, almost embarrassed. But Grandpa sold them when Mom got sick. He said she needed medicine more than we needed wheels. Keanu didn't respond immediately. The air felt still around them. Finally, he said, Your mom sounds like she was wonderful. She was, Emma whispered. She used to sing to us at night. Grandpa still hums her song sometimes when he cleans. Keanu remembered that sound, the faint melody Walter hummed when he worked alone. Now, he knew where it came from. Michael broke the silence with a cheerful tone. Grandpa says he's gonna save enough money to take us to the beach one day, but I think he just says that to make us smile. Keanu crouched again, meeting Michael's eyes. Don't be so sure. Your grandpa's the kind of man who keeps his promises, even if it takes a while. Emma looked up at him. You really think so? I know so, Keanu said gently. The security guard by the gate waved, signaling for them to move aside as a delivery truck turned in. Keanu stepped back and watched the two siblings wheel their bikes to the curb. The rain had left. Small puddles along the street, and the morning sun made them glisten like mirrors. Ride careful, all right? He said as they mounted their bikes. And tell your grandpa I said hi. They waved eagerly. Bye, Keanu, Emma called as they pedaled off, wobbling a little before finding balance. Their laughter trailed behind them like a melody the wind carried away. Keanu watched the two small figures until they disappeared down the street, their laughter fading beneath the distant hum of traffic. The image stayed with him, two children, fragile yet determined, riding away on worn bikes that barely held together. Something about it reached deep into a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. He stood by the gate a while longer, hands in his pockets, the morning bustle returning around him. The crew passed by, busy with their tasks, but he didn't move. His eyes lingered on the road where Emma and Michael had vanished, as though the world had quietly revealed one of its forgotten truths. When he finally walked inside, the set felt different. The noise, the lights, the endless rehearsing, all of it seemed so small compared to what he had just seen. Walter's quiet strength suddenly made even more sense. The man wasn't just surviving, he was carrying two young lives on his shoulders every single day. That night, Keanu sat alone in his trailer, the city lights flickering faintly through the narrow window. He had finished his scenes hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. His leather jacket hung from a chair, still damp from the morning dew, and an old photo album rested on the table beside him. He flipped through its worn pages until he found a picture of himself as a boy, thin, uncertain, standing beside his mother in a small apartment. His hair was messy, his smile tentative, but his eyes carried the same searching loneliness he sometimes saw in others. He traced the edges of the photo with his thumb, the memory washing over him. He knew what it felt like to be small, unseen, and hopeful all at once. He knew what it meant to have someone hold you together when life fell apart. Walter was doing that now for those children, the way someone once did for him. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Keanu closed the album gently. Outside, the city's neon glow shimmered across puddles left by the earlier rain. He looked at his reflection in the window, a man older now, but still carrying the boy who never forgot what it meant to be loved through hardship. He whispered softly to himself, no one should have to walk through the dark alone. And as he sat there, a quiet resolve began to form, the kind that started not with grand gestures, but with the simple desire to do what was right. The following morning, Keanu arrived at the studio before sunrise. The air was still, the pavement damp from a night drizzle, and the faint hum of generators echoed through the lot. He parked his motorcycle in the same quiet corner he always used and sat there for a moment, helmet in hand, lost in thought. The image of Emma and Michael struggling with their bicycles lingered in his mind. Their laughter had been pure, but behind it was something deeper. A quiet resilience that reminded him of himself when he had nothing. He knew he couldn't erase their pain or rewrite Walter's past, but he could help lighten the load just a little. The thought settled in his chest, calm but certain. He'd learned long ago that real kindness didn't need witnesses, it only needed heart. After a brief morning shoot, Keanu made his way toward the administrative wing of the studio. The halls were lined with framed posters and plaques, celebrating box office hits. But to him, they felt hollow. The people whose names weren't on those walls were the ones who made the pictures possible. He thought about Walter, about the janitors, the drivers, the maintenance crew people who worked in silence but held the foundation of the whole place together. He reached the HR office, knocking gently before stepping in. The woman behind the desk looked up, startled to see him. "Mr. Reeves, this is a surprise." Keanu smiled politely. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. I just needed a quick favor. Nothing for me, something for someone else." She nodded quickly, grabbing a notepad. "Of course. How can we help?" Keanu leaned against the counter, his tone quiet but deliberate. "There's a man who works the night shift here, Walter Hayes, janitorial staff. I'd like you to arrange a small bonus for him. Something discreet. No mention of me, no cameras, no statements. Just gratitude from the studio." The HR manager hesitated. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. May I ask what prompted this?" Keanu thought for a moment before replying. "He's been keeping this place running longer than most of us have been walking through its doors. That deserves more than a paycheck." She smiled softly. "That's incredibly thoughtful. I'll process it right away." "Thank you," Keanu said, adjusting his jacket. "Please, keep it quiet. It's important that he doesn't know where it came from." As he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the glass door, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For all the headlines and interviews he'd done over the years, this small, invisible act felt like the most meaningful one. Outside, the morning light brightened over the city skyline. Keanu pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts, until he found the name of someone he trusted, a local bike shop owner downtown who'd once repaired his old Triumph motorcycle for free. It was time for the next part of the plan. Keanu drove into the heart of downtown once the sun had fully risen. The streets were beginning to stir with the morning rush. Coffee cups in hands, umbrellas tucked under arms. He parked near a small shop with a faded sign that read, "Henderson's Bikes Family Owned Since 1975. The place had always felt old-fashioned, the kind of store that fixed things because they cared, not because it was profitable. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of rubber tires and machine oil greeted him. Rows of bicycles lined the narrow aisles, each one gleaming under the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Behind the counter stood Tom Henderson, the shop's owner, a gray-bearded man in his 60s with grease-stained fingers and the kind of easy smile that came from a lifetime of honest work. "Keanu Reeves," Tom said, recognizing him immediately. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you here today?" "Need another tune-up on that Triumph of yours?" Keanu smiled. "Not today, Tom. I'm here for something a little different." Tom wiped his hands on a rag. "All right, shoot. I need 2 bicycles," Keanu said. "Kids' bikes. One for a girl, about 10. Another for a boy, maybe 8. Something strong, good quality, but simple. No flashy colors or logos." Tom raised an eyebrow, curious. "Special occasion?" "Something like that," Keanu replied. "They belong to a man I know. He's been through a lot. His grandkids' bikes are falling apart, and I'd like to replace them, but I don't want it to be a big deal. No names, no attention. Just 2 bikes delivered to the studio tomorrow morning." Tom nodded, his eyes softening. "Understood. You've got a good heart, Keanu. Not many people think like that. Keanu shook his head. It's not about me. It's about making sure they know someone sees them. Tom studied him for a moment, then smiled. You're one of the rare ones. I'll make sure they're perfect. He turned to the back of the shop, calling to his apprentice. Lenny, bring out those 2 new Raleighs we just finished building. Within minutes, 2 small bicycles appeared, a red one with sturdy tires and a black one with chrome handlebars polished to a mirror finish. Keanu inspected them carefully, running his hand along the frame. They weren't extravagant, but they were beautiful in their simplicity, strong, dependable, exactly what Walter's grandchildren deserved. These will do, Keanu said quietly. Can you wrap them up with ribbons? 1 blue, 1 yellow, and please, make sure they're delivered early, before most people arrive. Tom nodded. Consider it done. Keanu took out his wallet, but Tom raised a hand. This one's on me, friend. I owe you for what you did for my nephew back when he worked security here. Keanu smiled. Then we'll split it. Fair's fair. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. You never let anyone do something nice for you, do you? Keanu just smiled. I get enough. Credit for things that don't matter. This one's for them. By the time Keanu left the shop, the morning sun had broken through the clouds completely, spilling light across the wet pavement. He strapped his helmet on and sat for a moment on his bike, thinking about how simple kindness could still change the shape of a day. No cameras, no charity foundations, just one small act done quietly where it belonged. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, Maria, asking if he planned to attend a late afternoon interview with a magazine that wanted to feature his humanitarian side. Keanu sighed softly before typing back, cancel it. Let's do something better with that time. When he arrived back at the studio, Maria met him outside his trailer, holding a clipboard. You canceled the interview? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I did, Keanu replied. There are more important things to focus on. She glanced at him curiously. You've been different these past few days. What's going on? He smiled faintly. Nothing dramatic. Just thinking about what really matters. She folded her arms. Which is? Keanu looked past her, watching a group of grips haul cables through the rain-slicked lot. People, he said. The ones no one notices. The ones who make everything work but never get thanked for it. Maria frowned slightly, intrigued. You're planning something, aren't you? He hesitated before answering, his tone light but purposeful. You could say that, but it's not a headline story. It's just something that should be done. Maria smiled softly. You know, most actors would turn that into a press release. Keanu shook his head. Kindness isn't meant to sell. It's meant to be felt. She studied him for a moment longer before nodding. All right, I won't ask. Good, Keanu said, his expression calm, because kindness is the only real headline that matters. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Keanu stood by the studio gates once more. He could already picture the moment. 2 children arriving the next morning, their eyes widening as they saw the new bicycles waiting for them, ribbons glinting in the light. Walter would probably shake his head in disbelief, maybe even fight back tears. Keanu didn't want to see it happen. That wasn't the point. What mattered was knowing that somewhere in that quiet moment, someone's world would feel a little lighter. And that was enough. The next morning began like any other for Walter Hayes. The sun had barely crept over the studio rooftops when he arrived, lunch pail in hand, the smell of dew still fresh in the air. He unlocked the janitor's closet, expecting to start another long, quiet day of sweeping and scrubbing. But when he pushed open the door, he stopped cold. Inside the small room, where the gray mop bucket usually sat, 2 brand new bicycles gleamed under the fluorescent light. One was red, with a small blue ribbon tied around the handlebars. The other was a sleek black with a golden bow shining against the seat. Both looked perfect, sturdy tires, polished metal, new grips, and a faint scent of rubber and oil. For a moment, Walter thought he must be dreaming. He stepped closer, blinking in disbelief. Resting between the two bikes was a folded note taped neatly to the wall. His hands trembled as he peeled it off and read the words written in simple black ink. For Emma and Michael, keep pedaling forward, from someone who believes in you. Walter's throat tightened. He read the message twice, then a third time, just to make sure it was real. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, and he reached out to touch the smooth paint of the red frame. The reflection of his trembling hand wavered on the surface. He had no idea who could have done this. The only people who even knew about his grandchildren were the ones who had seen him talking with Keanu outside the gate. His lips parted slightly as realization slowly began to form, but he didn't want to assume. Kindness like this was so rare, so unexpected, that it almost felt foreign. A few crew members passed by the open door, slowing their steps when they saw the bikes. "Whoa," one of them said softly. "What's all this?" Walter shook his head, still speechless. I don't know. They were just here." Another worker leaned in to look at the note. "For Emma and Michael," she read aloud, then turned toward him. "Those are your grandkids, right?" Walter nodded slowly, his voice trembling. "Yeah, they are." A murmur spread through the hallway. "It must have been Keanu," someone whispered. "Who else would do something like that?" Walter's eyes flickered toward the far end of the corridor, where Keanu's trailer usually Saturday. He didn't say anything, but a wave of emotion washed over him. Gratitude, disbelief, and something even deeper. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked beyond the uniform, beyond the mop, and seen the man inside it. He rested a hand on each bicycle, his calloused fingers brushing the ribbons. The color blurred through the moisture in his eyes. "No one's ever done anything like this for me," he whispered to himself. He stood there for several minutes, letting the moment sink in. Then, carefully, he closed the closet door and leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. The old man, who had spent his life cleaning up after others, suddenly found himself surrounded by something pure, respect, given freely and without condition. Word spread quickly across the studio floor. By mid-morning, nearly everyone had heard about the surprise gift waiting in the janitor's closet. People whispered in corners, glancing toward Keanu whenever he passed, though no one dared ask him directly. He went about his day as if nothing had happened, filming scenes, shaking hands, smiling between takes. But every so often, when no one was watching, he'd glance toward the hallway that led to Walter's little room. Walter, meanwhile, moved through his tasks with trembling hands. His heart still raced every time he thought of the bicycles. Between sweeping and polishing, he would pause to picture Emma's face when she saw the red one, Michael's grin when he tried to race her down the street. The thought made his chest ache with a joy he hadn't felt in years. He found Keanu later that afternoon, near the side entrance where the rainwater from yesterday still pooled along the curb. Keanu was leaning against a prop crate, talking quietly with one of the lighting technicians. When he noticed Walter approaching, he excused himself and turned with that same calm smile. "Hey, Walter," he said gently. "How's your day treating you?" Walter's voice shook. "Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to thank you. I know it was you. Those bikes, they're for my grandkids, aren't they?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, pretending to think. "What makes you so sure it was me?" Walter's eyes glistened. "Because no one else would have cared enough to do something like that. You didn't just make their day, you changed it." For a long moment, Keanu said nothing. The wind rustled softly through the trees lining the lot. Finally, he stepped closer, resting a hand on Walter's shoulder. His tone was quiet, but full of sincerity. "You've earned it, Walter. Every bit of it." Walter swallowed hard, unable to stop the tears that finally fell. "No one has ever respected me like that," he whispered. "Not once in all my years." Keanu's grip tightened slightly, steady and reassuring. "Then it's about time someone did." They stood there in silence. Two men from completely different worlds, joined by something simple and profound. Walter wiped his eyes and smiled through the tears. "Emma and Michael won't believe it. They'll think it's Christmas all over again." Keanu chuckled softly. "Just tell them it's from someone who believes in them. That's what the note says, right?" Walter nodded. Yeah. That note, those words, they meant more than you'll ever know. Keanu looked out across the lot, where the sun had begun to dip behind the studio rooftops. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. Someone who taught me that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps showing up, day after day. Walter smiled, his voice soft. That's all I've ever tried to do. Keanu nodded once more, then stepped back. And the world's a better place because you did. Walter watched him walk away, the weight in his chest replaced by something light, almost freeing. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel invisible. The shift in atmosphere didn't happen all at once, but rather like the quiet turning of a tide. The morning after the bicycles appeared, people began looking at Walter differently. The same crew members who used to walk past him without a word now stopped to greet him. Some offered coffee, others simply nodded, acknowledging his presence with a respect that hadn't been there before. In the cafeteria, a young caterer saved an extra plate of breakfast for him: scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice instead of the leftovers he usually picked through. When she handed it to him, she said softly, "You've been here longer than all of us. You deserve a fresh plate." Walter smiled, unsure how to respond, his voice cracking slightly as he said thank you. Even the production assistants, once the loudest in their mockery, seemed to change their tone. One of them held the studio door open when Walter passed by with his mop bucket. Another offered to help carry cleaning supplies. These were small gestures, but they added up, weaving a new sense of warmth into the air. It wasn't about the bicycles anymore. It was about what the act represented. Respect had become contagious. The director noticed it first. During a break between takes, he stood at the edge of the set, observing how people interacted. There was laughter, cooperation, and a gentleness that hadn't existed before. Walter's presence, once background noise, had become part of the rhythm of the day. Keanu walked by, carrying a script in one hand and a coffee in the other. The director stopped him with a half smile. "You didn't have to do that, you know." Keanu paused, meeting his gaze. "Do what?" The director chuckled. "The bikes. The bonus. Don't play dumb people talk." Keanu sighed softly, looking down for a moment. "I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just saw someone who deserved a little light." The director nodded thoughtfully. "You may not have meant to, but you started something. People are looking at each other differently now, like we're all on the same team." Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe we should have been from the start." There was no arrogance in his tone, only sincerity. It wasn't a lecture or an act of humility for show. It was truth, spoken as plainly as a man could say it. The director's voice softened. "You didn't have to do it, Keanu." "Maybe not," Keanu replied, "but we all should." The words landed like a quiet command. The director nodded slowly, letting the meaning sink in. Then he patted Keanu's shoulder and walked back toward the set, looking more thoughtful than before. That afternoon, the studio buzzed differently. The chatter felt lighter, the laughter kinder. People didn't step around Walter anymore. They worked beside him. The janitor, who had once been invisible, now stood at the heart of something quietly extraordinary. By mid-afternoon, the change had become impossible to ignore. The once divided world of the set actors on one side, crew on the other, now moved with unexpected unity. It wasn't forced, and no one had announced a new policy. It just happened naturally, as if Keanu's simple act had shifted the moral compass of everyone who witnessed it. Walter worked quietly as always, but now, when he passed through the makeup trailer, people smiled and greeted him. The sound team invited him to sit for a minute between setups. Even the extras, who usually kept to themselves, offered him bottled water during long takes. Each interaction chipped away at the wall that had kept him unseen for years. Keanu observed it all with quiet satisfaction. During lunch, he sat with the lighting crew instead of the cast. He cracked small jokes, asked about their families, and thanked them for the hours they put in. When someone mentioned how different the atmosphere felt lately, he simply said, "Kindness changes the temperature of a room." The production manager, Allison Rivera, overheard that conversation from across the table. Later that day, she called a brief meeting in the conference room with several department heads. "We've got something special happening here," she began. "And it started because one person reminded us what decency looks like. I don't want this to fade when the project wraps." There was a murmur of agreement. One of the camera operators said, "You mean like a recognition program?" "Something better," Allison replied. "A crew appreciation initiative. Bonuses for long-term staff, training opportunities for the janitorial and maintenance teams, even a shared meal once a month. We build community, not just credits." The others nodded, intrigued. Someone asked who'd inspired the idea, but Allison only smiled. "Someone who believes that being good shouldn't be rare." The proposal spread quickly, and by the end of the week, the studio had approved it. Word filtered down through the staff that the initiative would be named the Hayes Program, honoring the quiet janitor who had unknowingly sparked the change. When Walter learned of it, he was so overwhelmed he had to sit down. He found Keanu near the loading dock that evening, as the sky turned orange. "They told me they're starting a new program," Walter said, his voice trembling. "They're naming it after me. I don't know what to say." Keanu smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything, Walter. You earned it." "I just cleaned floors," Walter said softly. Keanu shook his head. "No, you reminded people what dignity looks like. There's a difference." Walter looked away, trying to hide the tears that formed again. "You know, I used to think people like me didn't make much difference." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Turns out people like you make the biggest difference of all." As the sun dipped beyond the studio rooftops, Walter walked home lighter than he'd ever felt. And though Keanu said nothing to anyone about what he had done, the echo of his quiet compassion kept rippling through every corridor, every corner, every heart that had seen it. The following week, Keanu sat at the long oak conference table in the top-floor boardroom of the studio. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Los Angeles skyline, bright and clear after another rainstorm. Around him, a dozen executives shuffled papers and glanced at digital calendars, their conversations buzzing with talk of production deadlines, release dates, and investor meetings. It was the same rhythm every week, fast, precise, detached. The meeting began with routine updates, box office projections, budget adjustments, upcoming shoots. Keanu listened quietly, his mind elsewhere. As charts flashed across the projector screen, he thought of Walter, how the man showed up before dawn and left long after everyone else. He thought about the catering staff, the drivers, the cleaners, who never appeared in press photos but kept the machine running. When the studio president finally looked up and asked if anyone had new business to discuss, Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "There's something I'd like to bring up." The room quieted. He wasn't known for speaking much during these meetings. "I'd like to talk about the people who work behind the scenes," he continued. "The ones we don't see in these reports. The janitorial staff, maintenance crews, drivers, the people who clean up after the rest of us." There was a pause. One executive frowned, glancing around as if unsure whether he was serious. Another tried to smile politely. "Of course, we appreciate them," she said quickly. "Without them, the studio wouldn't function." Keanu nodded slightly. Appreciation is good, but appreciation doesn't pay bills. That silenced the room. The executives exchanged uncertain looks. The studio president leaned back in his chair. "What are you suggesting, Keanu?" "I'm suggesting that we start treating these people like they're part of the same family we claim to be," Keanu said. "Better wages, reliable meals during long shifts, basic benefits, healthcare, paid time off. It doesn't take much to show that their work matters." Someone cleared his throat nervously. "With respect, Keanu, that's not really a production issue. It's more of an operations matter." Keanu met his gaze. "Operations keep productions alive. If the people holding this place together can't afford to live decently, then we're doing something wrong." His tone wasn't angry, but the weight behind it left no room for argument. The executives fell silent again. The studio president finally spoke, slower now. "You want us to revise the pay and benefits policy for all backstage workers?" "I want you to recognize their humanity," Keanu replied. "This industry runs on stories about heroes and justice. Maybe it's time we start practicing some of it ourselves." The words landed hard, echoing off the polished walls. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then the head of Human Resources, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, nodded quietly. "He's right," she said. "We've talked about reviewing support staff wages for months. Maybe this is the push we needed." Keanu gave her a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you. Let's not make it a headline. Just do it because it's right." The discussion that followed was unlike any the board had held before. Normally, debates revolved around marketing campaigns or box office forecasts, but now the focus shifted to people whose names never appeared in reports. A few executives hesitated, voicing concerns about budgets and margins, but Keanu countered each point with calm precision. "Think of the long term," he said. "Morale, loyalty, quality, those things don't show up on balance sheets, but they pay off. A company that treats people right keeps good people." The studio president studied him for a long moment, tapping a pen against his notepad. "You really believe this will make a difference?" Keanu nodded. "I don't just believe it, I've seen it. When people feel seen, they work with pride. And that pride shows in everything they touch, from the soundstage to the screen." The head of accounting leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Keanu spoke simply. "Increase the minimum pay for all custodial and maintenance staff. Add a hot meal service that covers the night crew. Make sure they have proper insurance coverage and access to training if they want to grow into new roles." There was another long pause. The president looked around the table. "How much are we talking?" The accountant flipped through a spreadsheet. "It's manageable," she said finally. "It's not going to break us." The president nodded, then looked back at Keanu. "And you want this tied to someone specific? A name? A program?" Keanu shook his head. "No names, no spotlights. I don't want Walter singled out. He's not doing this for recognition, and neither am I. Just make sure it happens quietly." The room went still again. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. The proposal was added to the official agenda, discussed briefly, and approved with a unanimous vote. No one raised objections. No one dared to diminish the sincerity behind it. When the meeting ended, the executives filed out slowly, still processing what had just happened. The HR director lingered behind. As Keanu gathered his papers, she said softly, "You know, this kind of thing doesn't usually happen in our business. You might have started something bigger than you think." Keanu gave a faint smile. "I didn't start it. Walter did." She frowned gently. "He'll never know the full extent of it, will he?" He shook his head. "That's how it should be. The best acts of kindness are invisible." Later that evening, as he walked through the nearly empty corridor, the faint echo of cleaning carts rolling along the polished floors reached his ears. He glanced down the hall and saw a janitor, someone else this time, humming softly while sweeping near the elevator. The man smiled and nodded as Keanu passed. Keanu returned the nod, feeling something stir inside him. A quiet satisfaction that went deeper than any film award or magazine cover could ever reach. The world might never hear about the policy change, but that didn't matter. The real change was already happening in every unseen worker who would walk through those doors tomorrow, feeling a little more valued, a little more human. And for Keanu, that was enough. The evening sky over East Los Angeles was painted in soft shades of amber and violet as Walter Hayes stepped off the bus and began his short walk home. The workday had left his body tired, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. The thought of Emma and Michael waiting for him always gave him strength, yet tonight felt different. He carried something invisible with him, a quiet sense of dignity, a reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often forgot. His apartment building was old but clean, the kind of place where neighbors shared groceries and kept an eye on one another's children. As he approached the courtyard, the sound of laughter broke through the evening calm. He froze at the sight of Emma and Michael, racing their new bicycles in wide, looping circles under the fading light. Their laughter echoed off the walls like music. "Grandpa, look how fast I can go!" Michael shouted, his small legs pedaling furiously. The black bicycle gleamed under the street lamp. the golden bow now tied neatly to the handlebars. Emma followed close behind on the red bike, her curls flying in the wind. "You can't catch me," she called, her voice bursting with pure joy. Walter set his lunch pail down and stood still, his throat tightening. The sight was almost too much to take in. For months, he'd seen worry in their eyes, the quiet sadness of children forced to grow up too soon. Now, they were just kids again, laughing, shouting, free. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Be careful," he called, his voice trembling. "Don't go too fast on that corner." They barely heard him, lost in their own world of speed and laughter. He smiled through his tears and made his way to the apartment. Inside, the air smelled faintly of laundry soap and the stew he'd left simmering in the slow cooker that morning. On the small kitchen table sat a single framed photograph of his daughter, taken years ago at a summer fair. She was smiling, brightly, her arms wrapped around Emma and Michael when they were just toddlers. Next to the photo, he had carefully placed the handwritten note from the janitor's closet, the one that had changed everything. "For Emma and Michael, keep pedaling forward. From someone who believes in you." Walter traced the words gently with his fingertips. The paper was already beginning to curl at the edges, but he didn't mind. He wanted it to stay right there, beside her picture, a symbol of the goodness still left in the world. He sank into the worn armchair by the window, still listening to the laughter outside. The sound filled the small apartment, chasing away the silence that had lived there since his daughter's passing. "Thank you," he whispered toward the framed photo. "You were right. There are still good people in this world." The laughter outside continued long after the streetlights flickered on. Walter watched from the window, his heart swelling as Emma and Michael wove around each other in dizzying circles. Their joy seemed to wash away years of heaviness. For so long, their home had been quiet, shaped by routine and grief. Now, the sound of spinning wheels and childish laughter filled every empty corner. He opened the window slightly, letting in the cool night air, mixed with the scent of rain and asphalt. "All right, you two," he called gently. 10 more minutes, then homework and dinner." "Yes, Grandpa," they answered in unison, their voices bright. He chuckled softly and sat back, letting the moment sink in. The apartment was humble, 2 bedrooms, faded wallpaper, furniture older than the children, but to him, it felt like heaven tonight. The glow from the single lamp cast a warm circle of light over the kitchen table, where the note still rested beside his daughter's photo. He looked at it again and felt the same ache of gratitude that had carried him all day. He whispered, "You'd be proud of them, sweetheart. They're strong, just like you were." For a few moments, he allowed himself to remember her laugh, her stubborn streak, her gentle way of calming the kids. Then he imagined her looking down on them now, smiling as Emma steered around the courtyard and Michael tried to balance with one hand on the handlebar. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Walter opened it to find his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, holding a small plate of tamales. "I heard those children laughing," she said with a kind grin. "It's been too long since I've heard that sound from this building." Walter smiled, taking the plate. "You're right about that. Seems someone up there decided to remind us how good people can still be." She nodded knowingly. "You keep that faith, Walter. This world needs more of it." After she left, he placed the plate on the counter and looked once more at the picture on the table. He could almost hear his daughter's voice saying what she used to when times were hard. "Keep walking, Dad. Don't let the world make you small." He nodded toward her photograph. "I won't," he whispered. Not anymore. Outside, Emma and Michael finally slowed, their faces flushed with excitement. When they came inside, dripping sweat and joy, Emma rushed up to him and hugged him tight. "Grandpa, we're going to take care of these bikes forever," Michael chimed in proudly. "And we'll ride to school every day. We'll make Mom proud, too." Walter's eyes shimmered. "She already is, kids. She already is." Later, after they went to bed, Walter returned to the window. The courtyard was quiet again, the bikes parked neatly under the awning. He looked at the stars just beginning to appear and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. "Thank you," he murmured into the night. To whoever believed in us. A week later, the film wrapped. The soundstage that had once been full of shouting, rushing, and ego now carried an easy calm. The cast and crew were tired but lighter somehow, as if something unseen had shifted among them. They packed up gear, stacked lighting rigs, and folded cables. But there was a new rhythm to it all, an unspoken sense of teamwork that hadn't existed before. Walter moved quietly through the space, as always, sweeping corners and polishing the floors. But this time, people noticed. When he passed by, grips and camera operators greeted him by name. "Morning, Walter," one called out. "Coffee's fresh and catering, grab a cup before it's gone." He smiled and nodded, unused to the attention, but grateful all the same. He'd spent years blending into the background, his presence as constant as the walls themselves. Now, for the first time, he felt part of the scene instead of just the cleanup after it. In the break area, the catering team had set aside a seat for him. One of the younger crew members even handed him a sandwich. "You're sitting with us today, old man," the boy joked lightly, and Walter laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that startled even him. As they ate, someone tossed an empty soda can toward the trash, but another crew member caught it mid-air. "Hey," she said with a grin, "remember what we learned this month? Kindness is contagious. Let's not mess it up now." The group chuckled, and Walter shook his head, smiling. "You kids are something else," he said, sipping his coffee. From across the set, Keanu watched quietly between takes. He stood near the entrance, leaning against a stack of prop boxes, a faint smile on his face. He didn't need to be part of the conversation to feel its weight. The laughter, the ease, the way people treated one another. It was all the proof he needed that the message had taken root. He caught Walter's eye across the lot. For a second, they just looked at each other, the silent acknowledgement between two men who didn't need words to understand. Keanu lifted his coffee cup, slightly in salute. Walter nodded back, his expression full of quiet gratitude. Later that afternoon, the director announced, "Wrap." Applause filled the air, echoing through the cavernous stage. Crew members hugged, actors shook hands, and a few people wiped tears from their eyes. Walter stood off to the side, watching them celebrate, feeling both part of it and beyond it. He wasn't used to being seen, but now he was seen with respect. As the last lights dimmed, Keanu approached him. "You did good work here, Walter," he said softly. Walter chuckled. "Pretty sure you're the one who did all the good work." Keanu shook his head. "No, you did. You reminded people what matters." Walter's face softened, the corners of his eyes glistening. "I didn't do much, Mr. Reeves. I just kept doing my job." Keanu smiled gently. "Sometimes doing your job with heart is more than enough. You'd be surprised how rare that is." Walter looked down, trying to steady his voice. "You gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, dignity. That's a gift I'll never forget." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "You earned every bit of it. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." For a few seconds, they simply stood together in silence, surrounded by the faint hum of equipment being packed away. Crew members walked past, waving goodbye to Walter as though he were part of the cast. He waved back, still amazed at how much had changed in such a short time. When Keanu left to take a final call from the producer, Walter went back to polishing the floors one last time. The mop glided smoothly across the stage's glossy surface, reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. It felt symbolic, like wiping away the remnants of the old world to make room for something better. Across the set, a group of younger workers chatted near the sound booth. "You notice how everyone's acting different lately?" one of them said. "Feels, I don't know, lighter." Another crew member nodded. "Guess kindness really is contagious." Walter heard them and chuckled under his breath. The phrase rolled around in his mind, "Kindness is contagious." He'd never thought much about what one small act could do, but now he could see it everywhere. In the way people shared meals, in the care they took with their work, in the warmth that replaced what used to be tension. As he finished polishing the last section of floor, he caught sight of Keanu again. The actor was standing at the far end of the studio, talking to the director, his demeanor as humble and composed as ever. Then, without ceremony, Keanu turned, saw Walter, and gave him a slow nod. It wasn't grand or theatrical, it was real. A simple, silent message of respect between two men who understood that the smallest gestures could carry the heaviest weight. Walter returned the nod, smiling to himself. He didn't need words. That moment was enough. When the studio finally emptied out, Walter stayed behind a little longer, as he often did. He stored the mop, checked the supply closet, and turned off the remaining lights. The space was quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. Every corner seemed to hold a faint echo of laughter and light, evidence that something genuine had taken root here. Before heading out, he paused by the door, taking one last look at the now spotless stage. "Not bad, old man," he murmured. "Not bad at all." Outside, the sun was setting over the lot, painting the clouds in gold and pink. Walter adjusted his cap, tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, and began the slow walk toward the bus stop. On his way out, one of the grips called after him. "Hey, Walter, don't forget crew lunch on Friday. You're coming, right?" Walter laughed. Wouldn't miss it. As he walked down the sidewalk, his reflection moved across the studio windows, merging with the fading light. Behind him, the building buzzed softly, still alive, with energy still changed. Keanu stepped out a few minutes later, watching Walter disappear around the corner. He didn't say anything, just smiled faintly and exhaled. The quiet revolution was complete. It hadn't come through speeches or cameras, but through something far simpler. Respect, shared from one heart to another. And as the studio lights went dark, it was clear that everyone, Walter, the crew, and even Keanu, had walked away a little better than before. The morning of the final shoot arrived quietly. The studio lot was bathed in soft light, the air crisp and still. Trucks lined the back entrance, ready to carry away props and equipment. There was the usual chatter of goodbyes and laughter between crew members, but beneath it lingered something deeper, a shared awareness that this project had been different. Something about it had touched everyone. Keanu arrived early, as he always did, coffee in hand and calm as ever. He spent a few minutes speaking with the director, then took a slow walk across the empty soundstage. The floor gleamed, spotless, reflecting the morning light in a way that made the place feel almost sacred. He knew who had done that. He smiled faintly, realizing that this might be the last day he'd see Walter here. Sure enough, Walter was in his usual spot, near the supply closet, tightening the lid on a bucket of cleaning solution. His uniform was neatly pressed, his cap slightly tilted back. When he saw Keanu approaching, he hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out something carefully wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Reeves," Walter said, his voice soft but steady, "before you go, I wanted to give you something." Keanu stopped, a hint of surprise on his face. "You didn't have to do that, Walter." "I know," Walter said, smiling, "but I wanted to." He handed over the package with both hands. Keanu accepted it gently and began to unwrap it. Inside was a simple wooden frame containing an old black and white photograph of the studio from the early 1980 seconds. The paint on the buildings was faded, and the sign above the main gate was barely legible, but the photo radiated history, decades of dreams, sweat, and effort. Walter looked at it, his eyes distant. "I found that photo years ago when they remodeled the maintenance office. Thought I'd keep it as a reminder of where this place started. Back then, I was just a young guy pushing a broom, trying to feed my family. Never thought I'd still be here 40 years later." Keanu studied the picture, tracing the edge of the frame with his thumb. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Walter smiled. "This place meant everything to me once. Then, somewhere along the way, it stopped. It became just work. But lately," his voice wavered, "now it means something again." Keanu looked up, meeting his eyes. The sincerity in Walter's expression was almost overwhelming. "No, Walter," he said softly. "You're what gives it meaning." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soundstage around them seemed to fade into silence. the rest of the crew instinctively slowing their movements as they watched the exchange unfold. The camera operator nearby lowered his gear, realizing instinctively that this was one of those rare unspoken moments worth remembering, not because it was grand, but because it was real. Keanu extended his hand. Walter took it firmly, the handshake strong, grounded, and full of respect. For a long moment, neither man let go. The handshake wasn't one of ceremony or courtesy. It was a quiet exchange of gratitude between equals. Walter's calloused hand trembled slightly, but his grip remained strong, and Keanu's eyes met his with calm, genuine warmth. The few crew members watching nearby fell silent, their chatter dying into a hush. Something about the moment felt sacred, too personal to interrupt. Walter's voice broke the stillness. "You know, I used to think this place didn't see people like me. We cleaned up the sets, fixed the leaks, and disappeared before anyone noticed. But now it feels like I was part of something after all." Keanu nodded. "You always were. It just took the rest of us too long to notice." Walter chuckled softly. "Well, better late than never." They both smiled, and the tension dissolved into quiet ease. Keanu turned the photograph over, noticing a faint pencil mark on the back. Walter had written a single line there. "For the man who remembered the ones time forgot." Keanu exhaled slowly. "This means a lot, Walter." "It's not much," Walter replied. "But that photo seemed more than either of us ever will. Figured it should go to someone who'll understand what it represents." Keanu looked at him with genuine admiration. "I'll keep it somewhere that matters." Behind them, a few of the crew members stood watching, pretending to busy themselves with cables and lights. One of them, a young camera assistant, whispered, "Man, that's the kind of stuff they don't teach you in film school." Another nodded, his eyes misting. The director, standing nearby, cleared his throat softly. "We should probably roll credits on that," he murmured, half joking. "That's the best ending I've seen in years." Keanu smiled faintly, but didn't answer. He just gave Walter's shoulder a firm pat before letting go of his hand. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And take care of those kids. They've got a good man raising them." Walter blinked back tears, trying to hold himself steady. "You too, Mr. Reeves. You keep doing what you do, making people believe in good again." Keanu gave a humble nod. "I'll try." As Walter turned to leave, the camera operator lifted his lens instinctively, wanting to capture the moment. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of it, or maybe it was the realization that not everything needed to be filmed. Some moments were meant to be lived, not recorded. Walter exited the stage slowly, carrying his mop and bucket one last time, but now his steps carried purpose rather than weariness. When he passed the catering table, several crew members clapped him on the back. One of them said, "Hey Walter, don't be a stranger." He smiled. "You'll see me around. Can't keep a floor this shiny without me." Laughter followed him as he left through the side door. The sunlight caught his figure for just a second before he disappeared into the lot, a humble silhouette walking into a brighter day. Keanu stood alone for a while, still holding the framed photo. The reflection of the studio lights shimmered across the glass, blending the faces of the past with the present. It struck him how full circle it all felt. The building, the people, the lessons. He whispered softly, "You gave this place its soul back, Walter." A quiet breeze drifted through the open stage doors, carrying with it the faint echo of laughter from outside. It was the kind of sound that lingered gentle, hopeful, and real. As the last of the crew packed up and the lights dimmed for the final time, Keanu placed the photograph carefully into his bag, his expression peaceful. Some stories don't need an audience to matter. This one already had its ending. A few quiet weeks passed after production wrapped. The studio lot returned to its usual rhythm. New projects, new faces, new stories being built from the ground up. But something about this one lingered. The people who'd worked on that set carried it with them. The memory of what had happened between Keanu and Walter. It wasn't loud or showy, but it left a mark on everyone who'd seen it. It began with a single post. One of the crew members, a young lighting technician named Josh, shared a short message on social media late one night. It wasn't a photo or a video, just words. He wrote, "I worked on a set recently where I saw something I'll never forget. A world-famous actor treated a janitor like family. He didn't do it for cameras or praise. He did it because it was right. And because of that, the entire crew changed. Kindness is contagious. Within hours, the post began to spread. By morning, it had tens of thousands of likes. By the end of the day, it had been shared across platforms, translated into multiple languages, and picked up by entertainment blogs and news outlets. No one named names, but it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Photos from the set surfaced, showing Keanu chatting with crew members, laughing with grips, and carrying coffee to lighting assistants. The narrative took shape on its own. Keanu Reeves quietly honors studio janitor, changes entire production culture. Keanu's publicist called him the next morning, sounding both thrilled and exasperated. "You've gone viral again," she said. "People are calling you the internet's moral compass." Keanu just chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "That's ridiculous. I just talked to a man who deserved to be heard. That's exactly why they love you," she replied. But Keanu made no comment, no post, no interview. He refused to let the story become about him. Whenever reporters asked, he redirected the conversation back to the crew, to the film, to the message that hard work and kindness deserved equal recognition. He stayed quiet, allowing the moment to live without his voice guiding it. Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the east side of the city, Walter began receiving mail stacks of envelopes arriving at his building every few days. The first letter came from a woman in Oregon who wrote, "My husband was a janitor for 20 years. People never saw him either. Thank you for reminding the world that good men like him still exist." Then came more from students, from single parents, from people who had worked behind the scenes their entire lives. Each letter carried its own kind of gratitude. Some sent small gifts, others drawings from their kids, and a few simply wrote, "You made me proud of what I do." Stacking them neatly in a shoebox beside the note that had started it all, Walter never could have imagined how far one small act of kindness would travel. Every few days, he would come home to find more envelopes in the mail, slots some handwritten, others typed, each carrying a story of someone who had once felt invisible. There were letters from custodians, security guards, nurses, truck drivers, and teachers. A man from Detroit wrote, "I sweep factory floors at night. Your story made me hold my head a little higher today." A teenager from Ohio sent a note that said, "I want to grow up to be like your grandpa." At first, Walter tried to write back to each of them. He'd sit at his kitchen table in the evening, Emma and Michael doing their homework beside him, and he'd dictate short replies while Emma wrote them down in her neat cursive. But after the 50th letter, it became impossible to keep up. So instead, he kept them all, neatly bundled, with twine, stacked beside the framed photo of his daughter and the note that had changed his life. One afternoon, while sorting through the mail, he found a small envelope addressed in crayon. Inside was a drawing from a child, a stick figure of a man holding a mop, standing beside two smiling kids on bicycles. Above it, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Keep pedaling forward." Walter stared at it for a long time, tears filling his eyes. He called the children into the kitchen. "Look what someone sent us," he said, holding up the drawing. Emma smiled and taped it beside the photo on the refrigerator, right next to her mother's picture. "That's perfect," she said. "Now, it's like a family portrait." Walter nodded, his throat too tight to speak. A week later, his small bonus check from the studio arrived, the one Keanu had requested quietly through HR. He looked at the amount and thought about what to do with it. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't about bills or groceries. It was about possibilities. That weekend, he took Emma and Michael downtown to a small science center that hosted a weekend club for kids. He'd seen the flyer months ago, but never had the money to sign them up. The instructor, a kind woman named Dr. Harris, welcomed them warmly. "Are these your grandkids?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Walter said proudly. "They love learning. I figured it's time I invest in that." Emma grinned, clutching a small astronomy booklet. "We're gonna build a rocket, Grandpa," Michael chimed in excitedly, "and make it fly." Walter laughed, feeling his heart swell. Just don't aim it at the apartment, all right? As the kids ran off to join the group, Dr. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. Not every guardian takes the time to do this. They're lucky to have you. Walter smiled softly. I'm the lucky one. That night, as they rode the bus home, Emma leaned her head on his arm, her voice sleepy. Grandpa, do you think the man who sent us the bikes knows how happy we are? Walter looked out the window, the city lights flickering past. I think he knows, he said. And I think he'd want us to keep spreading that happiness. At that same hour, across town, Keanu sat in his home office. A quiet evening stretching before him. On his desk sat the framed photograph Walter had given him, the old studio from the 1980 seconds, a reminder of the generations of workers who had built more than sets. They had built legacy. He glanced at it, then at the small notebook beside it where he'd scribbled an idea for his next film. At the top of the page, he had written just 3 words: Ordinary people matter. He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair as the thought settled in. The story of Walter Hayes wasn't over. It was only the beginning of something larger, a movement born not from fame or money, but from one man's humanity recognizing another's. And somewhere out there, in countless workplaces and homes, people who had once felt invisible now stood a little taller, proof that the ripple of respect was still moving, still growing, still alive. Months passed, seasons turned, projects came and went, but one story refused to fade, the quiet one that had taken place far from headlines and cameras. When Keanu returned to the same studio for his next film, he felt a wave of nostalgia walking through the gates. The air smelled the same: coffee, paint, and sawdust, but the atmosphere was different, lighter, warmer. Crew members waved as he passed. Some were new, others familiar faces from the last shoot. He noticed how people spoke to one another, now casual greetings between departments, laughter shared between workers who once moved in separate worlds. There was no tension, no invisible divide. The culture had shifted, quietly and permanently. As he entered the main building, he stopped short. Near the entrance, mounted on a freshly painted wall, was a bronze plaque. The light from the skylight above gleamed across its engraved surface. It read, "In honor of the people who keep our stories clean and our dreams shining." Beneath the inscription was a list of names: janitors, maintenance staff, and custodians who had worked at the studio over the years. Near the bottom, carved carefully and clearly, was one name that made Keanu's breath catch: Walter Hayes. He stepped closer, tracing the letters with his fingertips. The metal was cool beneath his hand, but the gesture felt warm, almost sacred. Around him, a few employees passed by, offering small smiles as they noticed him looking at the plaque. One of them, a young production assistant, paused. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. "They put it up last month. The studio calls it the Heart of the Lot Wall. It was inspired by something that happened during your last film." Keanu glanced at her with a faint knowing smile. "I heard," he said simply. She smiled back. "They said one act of kindness started it all." Keanu didn't reply. He just looked back at the plaque and stood there for a moment longer, lost in thought. The bronze letters caught the light again, and in them, he saw reflections not of fame or success, but of something far greater. Later that afternoon, when his scenes wrapped, he asked one of the coordinators if Walter was still around. "He retired a few months ago," she said, flipping through her notes. "Moved not far from here. I can give you his address if you'd like." Keanu nodded. "Please." That evening, as the sun dipped low, he drove through the quiet neighborhoods east of downtown. The sky was painted gold and lilac, the kind of light that made the world feel still. He turned down a small street lined with modest apartments and stopped in front of one with flower pots along the railing. Through the window, he could see a faint glow, a lamp, a man's shadow, and 2 small bicycles leaning against the fence outside. He smiled softly. He knew he was in the right place. Keanu parked his motorcycle and removed his helmet, taking a moment to breathe in the calm evening air. The faint hum of crickets filled the background, blending with the distant sounds of children playing somewhere down the street. He walked up the short pathway and knocked gently on the door. It opened after a few seconds, revealing Walter older, a bit grayer, but with the same kind, steady eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, a towel slung over his shoulder from washing dishes. The surprise on his face quickly melted into a broad smile. "Well, I'll be," Walter said warmly. "Keanu Reeves, right on my doorstep. Didn't think I'd ever see that day again." Keanu grinned. "You make good coffee, Walter. I figured it was worth the trip." Walter chuckled, stepping aside. "Then come on in, son. The pot's fresh." The small apartment felt familiar, simple, but full of warmth. Family photos lined the shelves, along with a few drawings from Emma and Michael pinned to the wall. On the kitchen table sat the same framed photograph of Walter's daughter, and beside it, the handwritten note Keanu had once left in the janitor's closet. "For Emma and Michael, keep pedaling forward. From someone who believes in you." Keanu's eyes softened when he saw it. "You still kept that?" Walter poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one over. "That note changed my life," he said. "It reminded me that people still see each other. You'd be surprised how much that means to an old man who used to feel invisible." They sat at the small table, the hum of evening settling around them. The room smelled of coffee and rain from an open window. "I came back to the studio today," Keanu said quietly. "They've put up a plaque. Has your name on it." Walter blinked, surprised. "Mine? You're kidding." Keanu shook his head. "Right there on the wall by the entrance. It says, 'In honor of the people who keep our stories clean and our dreams shining.'" Walter was silent for a long time. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied gently. "You gave that place meaning. All I did was notice it." Walter let out a deep breath. "You didn't just change my job, Keanu. You changed how I see myself. I used to think I was just background someone who kept the floor shiny so other people could stand in the light. But now I realize I was part of that light all along." Keanu nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "That's what respect does, Walter. It reminds us we were never small." They both fell silent after that, sipping their coffee as the night deepened. From outside came the sound of bicycles on the sidewalk, Emma and Michael returning from a ride. Their laughter filtered through the open window, bright and pure. Walter smiled, eyes glistening. "They're growing fast," he said. "Emma's talking about becoming a teacher. Michael wants to build rockets. Who knows, maybe one day they'll ride one to the stars." Keanu smiled back. "I don't doubt it. They've got your determination." Walter laughed softly, then leaned back in his chair. "You know, it's funny. I spent 40 years cleaning that studio, and it took a movie star to make me realize I was part of the story all along." Keanu looked at him kindly. "You always were the story, Walter. The rest of us were just catching up." For a long while, they simply sat there, 2 men bound not by fame or fortune, but by quiet understanding. The coffee grew cold, but neither cared. Outside, the laughter of children carried into the night, and for both of them, it sounded exactly like hope. The next morning, the sun stretched gold across the horizon, spilling over the Hollywood Hills as Keanu Reeves rode his motorcycle through the quiet streets. The wind brushed against his jacket, carrying with it the scent of dew and asphalt. He rode past palm-lined boulevards, his reflection flickering in the shop windows. The city was awake, but calm, one of those rare mornings where the noise of fame felt far away. He had finished his meeting at the studio earlier that day. The plaque still lingered in his mind, the shimmer of bronze, the engraved names, and especially Walter's. He had stood there longer than he expected, his fingertips resting on the cool metal, reading the words over and over. "In honor of the people who keep our stories clean and our dreams shining." As the motorcycle weaved through traffic, Keanu thought about how far one small act of kindness had gone. No headlines, no cameras, no spotlight. Just one man choosing to see another. and the ripple it created a movement of respect that had reached across lives and cities. He remembered Walter's voice the night before, soft and steady. "You didn't just change my job, Keanu. You changed how I see myself." Those words replayed in his mind like a melody. At a red light, he stopped and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He thought of Walter's trembling hands, the framed photograph, and the laughter of two children racing through the courtyard on bicycles that gleamed beneath the streetlights. He smiled faintly, realizing that those moments were more valuable than any award he'd ever received. The light turned green, and he eased forward, the engine humming beneath him. The road ahead curved gently toward the ocean, where the horizon stretched endlessly. He let the silence fill the space around him, the hum of the motorcycle blending with the rhythm of his thoughts. He'd spent decades surrounded by lights, applause, and the endless demands of the industry. But moments like this, quiet, human, genuine, were what stayed. The way a janitor's pride could lift an entire crew. The way respect could rebuild what cynicism had broken down. The way one gesture could restore faith in a world that often forgot how to care. He thought about all the people like Walter, the ones who cleaned, built, delivered, repaired, and supported the world from behind the curtain. The unsung hearts who carried everyone else's dreams without complaint. Maybe true greatness wasn't found on a stage or in a camera's frame. Maybe it lived in those invisible spaces, in the choices that no one else would ever see. As the sun began to lower again, glinting off the ocean ahead, Keanu slowed his bike near the overlook. He parked, took off his helmet, and stood there, watching the waves crash in slow rhythm against the rocks below. The day was quiet, still, and full. He whispered to himself, "Real greatness isn't about being seen. It's about what we give when no one's watching." The words lingered on the wind, carried toward the sea like a promise. Keanu stayed at the overlook for a while, letting the hum of the waves fill the silence around him. The ocean stretched endlessly, the sunlight glimmering across its surface like molten gold. Somewhere behind him, the city continued to move, directors shouting, cameras rolling, people chasing dreams. But here, none of that mattered. Here, there was only stillness and the quiet understanding of what life was really about. He thought again of Walter's words, simple but profound. "You didn't just change my job, Keanu. You changed how I see myself." That wasn't a compliment. It was truth. And truth had a way of leaving an imprint that no applause could match. He pulled off his gloves and leaned against his motorcycle, his eyes soft as he looked toward the horizon. The world often measured success by numbers, followers, awards, box office records, but standing there, he knew the real measure of worth was far quieter. It was in the moments no one recorded, the kind you couldn't buy or fake. He pictured Walter sitting at his kitchen table with his grandchildren, that old note framed beside their mother's photograph. He imagined the kids riding those bicycles, laughing freely, the sound echoing through the courtyard. He imagined the ripple that had followed people who now treated others differently, simply because they'd witnessed respect in its purest form. Every act of kindness, he realized, had its own gravity. It pulled people towards something better. He remembered something his mother once told him long ago, before the fame, before the noise. "You can't fix the whole world, Keanu, but you can make one person's world brighter. Start there." He smiled at the thought. She'd been right. Maybe that was all anyone could ever really do. He glanced back toward the city skyline glowing under the fading sun and whispered under his breath, "We may never change the whole world, but we can change someone's world." That's enough. The wind picked up, cool and gentle, tugging at his jacket as if to agree. He slid his helmet back on and started the engine. The bike roared softly to life, and he turned back toward the road. As he drove, the lights of Los Angeles began to flicker on one by one, windows glowing, streets shining, lives unfolding. He thought of all the unseen hands that made those lights possible. Electricians, cleaners, drivers, builders, people who worked when others slept, who kept the world moving without recognition, and he made himself a quiet promise to keep noticing them, to keep reminding others that the truest measure of success wasn't in wealth or fame, but in compassion. As the sky darkened into deep shades of violet, Keanu merged onto the highway, the wind whipping through his hair. The world rushed past in blurs of color and motion, but his mind remained still, at peace. Every mile felt like a heartbeat, echoing the same truth. Respect doesn't cost a thing, but it changes everything. When he finally disappeared into the distance, the story he left behind kept living in the hearts of those who'd heard it. An actor, a janitor, 2 children, and the quiet reminder that even the smallest gesture can start a chain of goodness that never ends. And now, it belongs to you, the listener, the dreamer, the person who believes kindness still matters. So here's a question to carry with you. Have you ever met someone who reminded you what respect truly means? And tell us, what small act of kindness will you do this week to keep the light moving forward? Because somewhere out there, someone's world is waiting for your spark.